I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, and I have the great honor and privilege of being president of the Urban Institute. And I'm really pleased to welcome you here today. We talk about an important topic. As everyone knows, the issue of school choice and vouchers is a hot one in the news today. And so we're here to talk a little bit about findings from the third year of results from the Louisiana Scholarship Program, and more generally a discussion of how this research and others can inform the national policy debate that we're having. I want to make a special welcome to the University of Arkansas researchers and the Education Research for New Orleans team who are here today. They are the driving force behind the work that we're going to be talking about, and they have released previously several studies examining how Louisiana's program has affected students and their community. I also want to welcome those of you who are watching online, and thank you for joining us. Just briefly will mention that the Urban Institute is a research organization where we like to try to use evidence, data, and research to inform public policy, what we like to call elevating the debate. Because we happen to think that public policies work best when they are rooted in facts. And while we are located here in DC, we know that education leaders who are all around the country, and many of you watching online, are grappling with implementing effective public policies, all aimed to expand opportunities for people and reduce hardships for the most vulnerable. Part of grappling with implementation is confronting disagreement. And those disagreements happen at every level, from within a community or within the governance of a school district to the federal government, about what is the best way to help vulnerable students. The new administration has put great emphasis on school choice programs as one such pathway, although it's not yet clear what a federal agenda in this regard of school choice policy might look like and which students might benefit. I don't need to remind you, however, that this is not a question of first impression. In fact, the states have been experimenting with school choice programs for years. Of the 25 voucher programs currently operating in 14 states, the oldest, Milwaukee's, is nearing its 30th year. Research on these voucher programs, however, has been limited, and the early research found neutral to positive impacts. Some more recent studies from Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, and Washington, D.C. have actually found negative impacts on student learning. And we all know that in the policy fray, sometimes people pull the evidence that they find most aligned with the arguments they were already inclined to support. And so part of what we try to do at the Education Policy Program here at Urban is to try to help people sort through the significance of aligned and sometimes conflicting research and help them figure out what are the conclusions that one can rightly draw from not only an individual study but a field of work. Sorting what are the best studies and hosting convenings and helping support policymakers as they make these kinds of analysis. The evaluation we're talking about here today is on the Louisiana Scholarship Program, and it is significant actually because the results of the evaluation are statistically insignificant. This is something only that a bunch of academics could perhaps find exciting. But in fact, we know that there are really important lessons to learn in Louisiana that might inform voucher programs and policies around the country. And we look forward to hearing about more of that from Professor Wolf. We hope you'll help us to broaden this conversation by participating further online today. You can share it. We would love that we all stop doing our emails, but I strongly encourage you to, yeah, Matt looks up. He's tweeting. All right, see, that's my guy. But we put on your agendas today the Twitter handles of the speakers, and we want to help their audiences, them reach new audiences and the audiences for their work as well. So join the conversation even as it's going on, taking advantage of using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban so that everyone can be part of the same conversation and also reach all of our networks. When we get to the Q&A portion, those of you who are online watching, you can join us by sending an email to events@urban.org, and we'll be collecting them throughout the event and sharing them with the moderator at the time of the panel. To get us started, we're going to hear from Professor Patrick Wolf, who has been the key evaluator for these last several years of evaluations of the Louisiana Scholarship Program. He's a distinguished professor of education policy and the 21st Century Endowed Chair in School Choice at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. In his research work, Professor Wolf mainly leads or assists with rigorous longitudinal evaluations of private school voucher systems. He's going to lead us off with a brief discussion of the Louisiana evaluation, and then after that, John White, who's Superintendent of Education in Louisiana, is going to share his perspective from on the ground. Superintendent White has made it his mission in Louisiana to modernize expectations and curriculum for all students and to provide families with expansive school options irrespective of their finances. After that, we will move to a panel discussion which will be led by Urban's own Matt Chingos, who is now leading Urban's education policy program. So we'll start with Professor Wolf. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Okay, well, thank you, Rachel, and we appreciate the Urban Institute hosting this release of our studies. Matt Chingos and his team have been tremendously helpful. As Rachel mentioned, this release of reports is a collaboration between the School Choice Demonstration Project at the University of Arkansas and the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans, headed by Doug Harris of Tulane University. So we are grateful to Doug for all of his assistance in making this happen. And we are extremely grateful to Superintendent John White for making the data available so that we can study private school choice in Louisiana. So at the risk of this becoming a Oscar acceptance speech, I also have to thank my junior colleagues who are here. They are the three people who are the lead authors of the three reports that I will be discussing here. Dr. John Mills of the University of Arkansas is the lead author of the Year 3 test score study. Dr. Sivan Tuchman of the University of Washington is the lead author of the Special Education Identification Study. And UJ Sude is the lead author of the Participating Schools Study. Now, Corey DeAngelis, who is not here, is a co-author of the Participating Schools Study. He is stranded on a beach in San Diego. So our thoughts and prayers go out to Corey in hopes that he can get off of that beach very soon. Although many hands went into the production of these reports, this is scholarship by independent researchers. And so we are grateful for all this assistance, including the support of our funder, the Smith Richardson Foundation. But the results that we present here are solely the responsibility of the authors of the reports and do not in any way represent official positions of any of these supportive organizations. So, on to the actual study. So this is a study of the Louisiana Scholarship Program, which is a private school choice program. It makes scholarships or vouchers available to students to attend participating private schools. Those vouchers are worth up to 90% of the combined state and local funding for an individual student, but are capped at the tuition level of the participating private schools. And it's actually the tuition cap that most often determines the value of the scholarship. They averaged about $5,000 per student. To be eligible, a student must be at a family with income at 250% of the poverty line or lower, and they must have been attending a public school that was graded C or lower based on the state's accountability system. For the cohort that we study, the first year of the statewide expansion of this private school voucher program, there were 10,000 eligible applicants to the program, and a little over half of them received scholarship awards. So basically, this is a trend figure of participation in a private school voucher program in Louisiana. And you see it actually started in 2008. With a pilot program limited to the city of New Orleans to help it recover from the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, which wiped out much of the educational infrastructure for the city. So school vouchers started as this New Orleans pilot in 2008, And you see they expanded pretty dramatically in 2011-12 to a statewide program. Participation jumped from 2,000 students to 5,000 students. It has since grown to over 7,000 students. And we follow the expansion of this program in 2012, and we follow the first cohort out 3 years. So that cohort was skewed pretty heavily toward the younger grades in terms of enrollment. So over 2,000 of those 10,000 students were entering kindergarten at application, and over 1,000 were in first grade, over 1,000 in second grade, over 1,000 in third grade, and then it tapers off pretty significantly after that, with very few of this cohort of students applying to the school voucher program in the high school grades. So this is our second set of reports on the Louisiana Scholarship Program. Our previous set of reports were of kind of the immediate effects of the program, including their effects on racial integration in schools. We found that the school switches instigated by the LSP had a significant effect in improving the racial integration of public schools, as overwhelmingly minority students left overwhelmingly minority public schools, leaving them somewhat less minority in their student demographics. Their effect on the private schools that they transferred in was essentially null, as many of these students transferred into private schools in which their ethnicity was significantly represented. We also looked at the competitive effects of the program on student achievement in public schools, on the achievement of students who remained in public schools, and we found there was some evidence of positive competitive effects in math, but those results were not robust. They were not consistent across different statistical models and different measures of competition and competitive pressure. And finally, we found that the immediate effect of the Louisiana Scholarship Program on student test scores was negative, that the students who received the vouchers and switched to private schools on average scored significantly lower in both English language arts and math after 1 year. The drop in math was quite dramatic and large. And then there was a period of partial recovery of that lost ground in the second year. So that sort of raised the question of what's going to happen in the third year, what's going to happen over time with the achievement levels of participants in this program. So the 3 studies we present today address 3 research questions about private school vouchers. The first is what effect this program has on student achievement after 3 years. For that, we use a gold standard research design, a randomized controlled trial. So we compare the results for students who won a lottery for their first choice LSP school at baseline. We compare their results after 3 years with students who lost the lottery and therefore are in our experimental control group. For our second question, we look at the extent to which participation in the Louisiana Scholarship Program influenced a student's likelihood of being identified as having a special educational need if they were not so identified at the start, or to be de-identified as no longer having a special educational need if they previously had been identified as having a special educational need. So basically, the effect of switching to private school through the program on special education identification and de-identification. And the third is a study of the schools participating in the program, and for that we use statistical regression models, discrete choice models, to predict what kinds of private schools decide to participate in the program and what kinds of private schools don't. Now, I don't expect you to master all of the details of these research methodologies, but I will just assure you that each of them is the most rigorous scientific approach to developing reliable answers to the questions being posed. First, test score effects. And this is basically graphics, side-by-side graphics for ELA and math on the test score effects of the Louisiana Scholarship Program over the course of the 3 years of our study. let me just point out a few crucial elements of this graphic. The 50 percentile line, that is the average performance level of the control group in every year. So we set that at 50% for comparison purposes. The colored lines, the solid colored lines, is the average performance level of the LSP students over time. And the dashed lines above and below them are the 95% confidence interval. So basically, if all three lines are below, all three colored lines are below the black line in any year, that means that the program has had a statistically significant negative effect on student achievement. So we see with the English language arts graphic, we start at baseline with equivalence, baseline equivalence. The lottery worked. And then after 1 year, the average performance of the LSP students was the 40th percentile. That's 10 percentage points below the control group, and that is a statistically significant negative effect. But you see there's a recovery after that first year. By the second year, they're only 2 percentage points below the control group comparison, and that's not a statistically significant difference. And then by the third year, the LSP students actually averaged higher ELA test score outcomes than the control group, but that difference is not statistically significant. With the math graphic, we see, again, equivalence at baseline and a very large drop in the first year, a loss of 25 percentile points for the LSP students compared to the control group students. And again, we see partial recovery in the second year, but still that's a statistically significant lower level of achievement in the second year in math. And finally, by the third year, we have statistical equivalence for the LSP students compared to the control group. So overall, across both ELA and math in the third year, no significant differences between the LSP students and the control group. We looked at subgroups, and we only had 2 statistically significant findings of the effects of the program by subgroup. Students who started out with lower ELA scores actually realized statistically significant benefits from the program in terms of ELA performance after 3 years. And students applying in the younger grades had statistically significant negative math effects by the third year. So 1 positive subgroup effect in ELA, 1 negative subgroup effect in math. All the other subgroup effects we examined were not significant. We also looked at special education identification. Here, the dark line is a 0 line. That means that your likelihood of being identified as requiring special education services is the same if you're an LSP student or a control group student. So that would be right at the 0 line. We see the blue line is for new identifications of students. So for students who had not previously been identified as requiring special education services, we see that in the second and third year, there was a statistically significantly lower likelihood that they would be identified if they were in the LSP. For de-identification, we're limited to the students, the 13% of students who had special education identifications when they applied to the program. And for them, in the second year, they were significantly more likely to be de-identified, to have that student disability label removed from them if they were participating in the LSP. So our main findings on special ed identification is if you switch to the private sector through the program, there is a slightly lower chance you will be newly identified as having a disability, and there is a significantly greater chance that you will be de-identified if you already have a special ed identification. Finally, we looked at the schools that participate in the program. And so basically, when you have a private school choice program, students or schools make a decision about whether or not to participate, just as students make a decision whether or not to participate. Schools consider the costs of participation, the benefits of participation, and decide if they are in or out. And so basically what we did was we collected data about the schools participating in 3 different private school voucher programs: the Louisiana Scholarship Program, the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program right here, and the Indiana Scholarship Program. So two statewide, well, you could call it statewide if you consider DC a state. And what we found pretty consistently across the three is that the schools that had lower tuitions, that had higher minority populations and were Catholic were more likely to participate than those that weren't. And in Louisiana, we specifically also found that schools with lower enrollments were more likely to participate. So those are our findings, and they're all, the reports are all available at the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans website, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is John White. I am the State Superintendent of Education in Louisiana, which I am happy to say means that I oversee 1,400 public schools and several hundred private schools as well. In our state, the public school system and the government has a long history of subsidizing Catholic education and other non-public institutions, and this is an extrapolation of that function. So I'm really neither an advocate for private school choice unto itself, but I do see it as potentially, at least, a means of making high-quality schools, every single high-quality school possible, available to low-income youth. And I'll say that at the outset, as I see this survey, which is perhaps significant for its insignificance, you're kind of, I'm just going to keep saying it so it finally makes sense to me, you're kind of left as a policymaker saying, well, what is the significance of it from a policy perspective? And I think that within the Beltway and maybe in education policy circles, people come to these studies and ask, well, do voucher programs work? I just view that as the wrong question to ask. The question is, are there good schools, effective schools of all governance types, available to low-income and otherwise disadvantaged children? That is the essential question from a governance perspective, and unfortunately it's one that politicians and politics and ideology largely misses, because this issue has become a vessel for ideology on both sides of the aisle. But the findings are actually radically commonplace and totally understandable, which is that schools show improvement when they're placed within an accountability system, whether they're public or private. And the chart that Pat showed that showed the V-type curve is obviously indicative of that. And that by and large, when placed within the same system of measurement, public schools and private schools, which account for tens of thousands of kids each and hundreds of schools each, are not going to radically, as a sector, outperform the other. And so as a policymaker, that's what I take. Real improvement within an accountability system, as has always been the case within public systems in their first years of accountability. And secondly, by and large, across very, very large sectors of schools, comparable performance when measured in a comparable manner. And so I come out of this saying, how do we get to a point on this issue where both conservatives and liberals can drop the ideology and ask a very simple question, which is, what kind of rules, incentives, and programs do we need? What kind of systems do we need to make every possible quality school, verifiably quality school, available to the most disadvantaged kids? Our program takes a long-term approach to that question. It does so in the following ways. First, yes, as Pat said, it funds up to almost the full amount that a school would receive from its local and state tax base. But also, it puts schools that participate in the most heavily regulated program under a system of accountability that's effectively the same system that exists in the public process. One thing that we didn't get to in the discussion previously, I think for reasons of just time and brevity, is that there are less regulated school choice programs in Louisiana. And when you have less of a stake of the public's investment involved in your operations of your school, meaning a small tax credit, for example, that exists in Louisiana that simply subsidizes the private tuition payments that parents are already making, the government takes less of a regulatory role in your schools. So there are a lot of other schools in Louisiana that participate in much less regulated, much lower funded private school choice programs. But this being a program in which the public has remotely the same financial stake as it does in the traditional public system. These schools are regulated from an accountability perspective in a way that is similar to the traditional public system. The other piece that comes up in the political dialogue and the policy dialogue is admissions. And I think that admissions has just as much, if not more, to do with why schools decide than accountability, with why schools decide ultimately to participate in these programs. Louisiana's program is unique not just for its common accountability, but for the fact that it is an open admissions system as well. Parents rank schools as a preference. In fact, in the city of New Orleans, they rank them alongside on the same application that they rank public schools. But the government ultimately assigns a child to a school, and the school is legally obligated to accept that child, irrespective of previous academic history, irrespective of previous disability status, and so on. And that distinguishes our program too. So when a school accepts children sight unseen, no interview, no screen, when in the first year of the program those kids were assigned to the school in July and the school year starts in August, in a state that tests 4 different subject areas, and you're in an accountability system that's going to, in 6 months, be testing your kids to measure them on all of those subjects on tests you've never seen before, on standards with which you're not familiar, of course you're going to see a drop. And we did. And liberal ideologues paraded it about as the idea that somehow Catholic schools that had educated kids in Louisiana for centuries somehow are abject failures. And conservatives paraded around the idea that, conservative ideologues, that regulation is somehow anathema to choice and is driving away the elite schools that otherwise, they say this without evidence, but would have somehow magically served these kids somehow better than the schools that were participating. And that is a viable theory, but it was presented without evidence. And it turns out, I believe, that in its insignificant findings, the significance of this study is that it puts truth to the lies on both sides of the aisle, which is that it says to the liberals, who will often use admissions and accountability as their rationale for objecting to private school choice, you can have a very viable system where schools accept all kids without screens and where they take the same tests and they're rated in exactly the same system as in the public system, and the private schools can compete. But on the other hand, it says to the conservatives that actually the reason of over-regulating is not the reason for initial underperformance. And in fact, that it may well be that the very regulation itself, the accountability system, is the thing that has promoted the performance. And in fact, as my fellow New Orleanian and I, Doug Harris, were just discussing, over this course of time, Louisiana has said to many schools in the program, as it said to public schools, we're going to intervene as a state, and our intervention as a state is if you fall below the failing line in the public system and you're a private school, you don't take new kids. And that has happened on several occasions, many occasions, dozens of occasions in the time since the program started. The positives that I take in all of this from the perspective that we want as a state to make every disadvantaged child have as many high-quality options that can be verified as high quality are the following 2 things. First, by and large, probably not perfectly, but by and large, we've done a good job of making sure that the students who are served are truly the most disadvantaged. Every child in this program has a home that exists within 250% of the poverty line or lower. 87% of the children in this program are African American. And when students came into the program having previously tested, they tested on average, as the study shows, 20 percentile points below the statewide average on those state tests, which I take to mean they are by and large, on average, in the bottom third of academic performers in a state that has historically ranked quite low. This is, by all means, a high poverty, very undereducated population of kids. And I believe that for as positive as I think the Indiana results are around admissions too, the truth of it is that if every school is able simply to select their children, as much as I hate to say this, that level of underachievement, I don't believe, would be reflected in the population that we're talking about today. And secondly, that while the results show that there are not statistically significant performance in ELA and math for these students, at the school level, there is tremendous variation within the set of schools that are being studied. And that this wasn't an immediate product of the research, but in our own studies, when you apply regression analyses to every school and to the progress that every school makes, you see that there are some schools in this program that are performing at the 90th percentile and above in English, and at the 80th percentile and above in mathematics, which is incredibly encouraging. Like in the public system, there are also some that are way at the bottom. And I say that that's encouraging because now we have the data to differentiate between the two and to use our system to make those options available to every child, and that's incredibly encouraging. The guidance that I would give, therefore, is to recognize there is a precedent for all of this, and it's the charter school system. Charter schools have been able to make a case for their own growth in this country, largely because they've embraced the charge of serving the most disadvantaged youth, and because they've been willing to stake their own existence on their performance. That has allowed them to make a case for growth and scale that currently doesn't exist in the non-public sector. And so I would say to people on the conservative side that oftentimes the philosophical aversion to measurement and to regulation, I believe, is an impediment that they're going to have to get over if they're going to start making a case for growth. You need real results. You need comparable results to justify a national investment to scale. But the greater hypocrisy ultimately is on the left. And these studies of Indiana and Louisiana, and more specifically Louisiana, put truth to that hypocrisy, which is to say that putting aside the private school histories of so many liberal leaders who advocate positions against private school choice for low-income Americans, the way that this system operates should resolve the concerns around admissions and accountability. And I urge them to seriously square their beliefs, if you do get those concerns out of the way, as a liberal, that you should deny the social liberties to choose a school of a low-income American. I believe there's a third way. This study doesn't offer definitive effectiveness evidence on either side, but I believe there's a third way on school choice. I believe it is through a regulated school choice model. This study today offers certainly evidence that a lot of the concerns about a regulated school choice model and about school choice generally should be, or at least addressed. Give us some evidence those things can be addressed by way of this model, and perhaps give us hope that if our mission truly is to identify the best schools, the verifiably high-quality schools, and ensure that low-income kids and otherwise disadvantaged kids have access, that there is a model that allows that to happen in the private sector, the charter public sector, and the traditional public sector. Very blessed to be here. Thank the folks at Urban Institute for having me, and I'm looking forward to the panel, which, as I now understand, is going to come forward. Thank you.
For joining us today. Very much enjoyed Patrick's presentation and John's reaction. It's also my pleasure to welcome the two panelists that we haven't heard from yet. Beth Blaufuss is the principal at Archbishop Carroll High School right here in Washington, D.C. And Doug Harris is director of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans. So the big question I want to start with today, and then I'm hoping we can make some progress on throughout our discussion, is what's the point? Why do we bother with these studies? And we've heard a couple folks tell us that the studies come out and you can sort of pre-write everybody's talking points, right? You can just sort of say if the voucher critics or opponents, supporters, if the study comes out and it's positive or negative, you got your 2x2 box, you can kind of pre-write it, right? If you think if you don't like vouchers and a study that comes out that's good about vouchers, well then we don't believe the tests, or something like that. If it comes out it's bad, well then suddenly the tests are great and it tells us everything we need to know. So I want to start with Doug here because we haven't heard from you yet, and you've been involved in research on this for quite some time. What do you see as the role of evidence in an issue so contentious as vouchers?
Yeah, so thanks, Matt, and thanks, Pat, for all the hard work on this research. So I think, just to start off on that, I think one of the things that's unique about this work is just how comprehensive it is, right? To be asking all of these different questions, all of which pertain, I think, to your question about how the evidence matters. But I think the evidence matters more when you get at it in a comprehensive way, given all the questions, segregation, about how different schools are deciding to participate, as well as, of course, getting to the effects on students. So I think evidence is going to matter more when we do it that way, when we address the big questions that are really on everybody's minds. now, even when we do that, there's still a question, as you point out, about how people are going to interpret it. They're usually going to go right to the test score results and sort of focus on that, and they're going to take their ideological view. I think the evidence matters because I think it matters in the middle of the spectrum, right? So you have people at the extremes who have their positions and they're going to interpret it that way. But I think evidence, not just in this area, but in other areas that are controversial, it does matter for people in the middle who really want these things to work. People who care about raising academic achievement and for providing access to all children to great schools. So to take a counterexample, suppose it had stayed negative, right? So take these counterexamples. So suppose it had just flatlined at negative 25 or percentile points, and that had stayed the same in Indiana and Louisiana and other places. I think that would matter. I think that would change the conversation a bit. I think it would be much harder for advocates to push forward that way. Similarly, I think at the other end, if all the results were really positive, I think it would be harder uphill climb for people who are opposed to it to say it. So I think it does matter, and at least in the long term, it's certainly not going to be the only thing driving the debate, but I think it will be part of it.
What standard should we hold these programs to? Programs like this, like what does success look like? I mean, this is I feel like something we've heard discussed a little bit. Like, should we expect in kind of long-run equilibrium the average private school to be better than the average public school for kids who participate in these programs, or should neutral be a win?
Yeah. No, I think that was what was striking to me about the initial comments and about the debate, kind of where we are, is how much it's changed. So I think if you go back, for those who have followed this for a long time, if you go back 15, 20 years, the criticisms of public schools are really strong, and people basically saying the unions and bureaucracy, the system's failing. I mean, actually, you're still hearing some of that conversation right now that the government stinks, and we've got to take this in a very different way. That logic implies that we should expect private schools or alternative schools to be a lot better than traditional public schools. And it seemed, so my sense of some of the conversation is that now it's, well, as long as they're the same and we're providing more variety, that maybe that's enough. So it seems to be a different bar recently. So I personally, I think that we should be looking for better options, right? So we should still be looking for studies to show positive results, and these may eventually do that. So I do think these systemic reforms in general, where Vouchers is an example of it, charter schools is an example, No Child Left Behind is an example. Those things, the effects are not going to be immediate effects, right? The idea with these kinds of changes is to change the way people think, to change the kind of people who are running schools, to change the teacher workforce. Those things don't happen overnight. So I think this is still a work in progress. I think it's great that this research is continuing, and that the state is requiring, and in Indiana and Louisiana requiring that outcome data be collected so that we can do this kind of work, and that the state's making those data available so we can really do good research to see whether they do in fact get better. I still think that should be the bar, that we should be trying to improve on what we have.
Let your other folks weigh in. Beth, what does success for you look like? Maybe not for a whole program, but for your school. And same to John, how do you think about this question of what a successful school choice program looks like?
Well, I just wonder if the very nature of my perspective is that for me, success is measured in, like the 100 faces of this year's graduating class. So my metrics are very different than the rest of them, but they're also the metrics that every parent has. Like I don't know a lot of parents who are, except maybe parents in Washington, D.C., who, like really hunker down around a good data set before they pick a school for their kids, right? Like that's just not how, for lack of a better term to use economic language, how actors in this marketplace function. And so I do think that, part of the reason why I think this information is intimidating is that it also begs questions about the school choices of people who are not low income. It sort of raises questions about the value of private schools across the board. But I think schools also function as forms of social affiliation. Who do we drive around with bumper stickers for? Our sports teams and our schools, right? So I think, how does that play into sort of Patrick's study? Well, I don't know that it does, except perhaps to explain some of the emotions on either side. And I do think that call for maybe looking at how this can sort of temper the debate a little bit about does it work, does it not work, to look at the question of who does it work for? And is the value for the people for whom it works something that we as a whole culture are willing to back? I think is maybe a more interesting question. So I appreciate John sort of calling us to maybe look at different questions. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, people ultimately are not looking for test scores as the long-term value in making a decision as to where to send their children to school. And I hope that, and I actually think that given the good approach that both Arkansas and Tulane researchers have taken in their different roles here, we'll get to a point where we can say, has the move to more generously subsidized private schools publicly played out with long-term attainment gains that can't be captured here, and that maybe speak more to the social effects, for example, of religious schooling. The government has a role, however, in calling fair and foul, and there is foul. And I think it's harder to capture fully the value of everything that's fair, but there is a certain line that at some point you have to say is foul in the public sector and in the private sector. And I think ultimately that should be our objective, is to make sure that every child is attending a school that by any standard, and certainly no matter their home disadvantages, is a credible institution that has the hope of doing the things that are of long-term benefit. And within the public system and the private system, you see a lot of really good actors, and you see a small number of those that are really struggling to achieve the most basic tasks. These test-based cognitive measures are not perfect. They are, I guess in the most technical sense, they're proxies for something bigger that we're trying to extrapolate a value from. But they're the best way I know, as a regulator, across hundreds and hundreds of institutions, to say, let's try to draw a common line for fair and foul. And I think in doing that, we will hopefully progress toward at least a good intermediate state, which is more Louisiana kids who have the greatest level of disadvantage attend a school that has a good shot at producing a great long-term value.
So what you're really looking at is the distribution of schools, regardless of sector, and saying how do we have more of the good ones, less of the bad ones, and average differences across sector, whether it be traditional public, charter, private, is less.
Absolutely.
Less
and I don't mean to diminish there are some who I think genuinely believe out of some philosophical sense that public dollars shouldn't go to religious institutions. I think there are some who genuinely believe the government should not have any level of involvement in the regulating of religious institutions. I actually think those are pretty polar groups of people that happen to just play a very large role in this dialogue, and that most people just want the children of Louisiana, the children of the United States, and certainly their own kids to go to a great school. And so we're obligated to have a line where we say, look, if you're below this line, there's something definitively problematic. But on the other hand, not to try to over-engineer too much and draw too much value when you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of schools and tens of thousands of kids.
Patrick, I'm interested in your take on this question, but also in how you think research can tell us not just did it work, right, but about the design of the specific programs, kind of some of the questions John raised in his remarks around, the desirability of accountability and regulation. How does the existing research, what does it tell us about that, and kind of what do we still need to learn, and can we learn it from the kinds of studies?
Our tools for determining the effects, the overall effects of programs, our scientific tools are much stronger for making that determination than sort of sorting out, exactly what elements of evaluations increase or decrease their efficacy. There we have to be a lot more exploratory and often combine sort of statistical studies with qualitative research and such. We're starting to do that. I mean, there certainly have been some studies in the charter school area that have looked at best practices or characteristics of charter schools that are associated with higher student performance. There's been less of that in the school voucher area just because it's such a contentious issue. We just feel we need more and more studies about, do vouchers have generally positive or generally negative effects? But the reality is that science advances through the sustained accretion of reliable evidence on these questions. And so if you look at the voucher studies, we've generally looked at two different types of outcomes: achievement outcomes measured by test scores, attainment outcomes measured by graduation rates. And reasonable people can count the reliable studies a little differently, but basically findings of positive effects outnumber findings of negative effects, and there's a whole lot in the middle that's sort of inconclusive and indeterminate. And it may very well be it's because there's lots of what we would call heterogeneity in the effects. Some programs as designed have particularly positive effects on certain groups and not on other groups. The frustrating thing is this is varied across the studies. So when we kind of look at variation in effects by student group or by types of school, we're not yet seeing a consistent pattern. This is all sort of a roundabout way of saying there isn't any single school voucher effect that we've identified yet. There are lots of different effects for lots of different participants. And we have a long ways to go, I think, before we can really nail down elements of optimal design and things like that.
But a few years ago, I don't think you could point to a single high-quality study finding negative impacts on participants. So why suddenly are we seeing these negative studies?
Sure.
It feels like everywhere.
Yeah, well, so there have been three places, three private school choice programs that have demonstrated negative achievement effects. The Louisiana Scholarship Program initially, but in our longitudinal study, those go away by the third year. The Indiana Voucher Program initially, but similarly, the Notre Dame research team found by the third year those negative effects had gone away, and actually by the fourth year, for students who persisted in the program, their achievement effects switched to positive. And then in Ohio, in David Figlio's study of the Ohio Ed Choice Program, where he found negative effects even in the out years. So there's sort of only one left. There's the Ohio finding of negative effects. Well, DC after 1 year, right. And it'll be interesting to see whether that follows the Louisiana and Indiana pattern of going away, or if it persists like the Ohio pattern. I think a couple of factors. I mean, one is we have to think about the idea of scale. School choice initiatives, including charter initiatives and voucher initiatives, have shown their clearest positive effects in urban environments. Those are choice-rich environments. Those are environments where transportation really opens up a lot of choices for parents, and that's less true when you get outside of urban environments. So it may be that choice just doesn't have as strong of effects outside of urban environments. The other factor is that for many of these studies, certainly our Louisiana study and the Indiana study, the private schools were evaluated based on the state test. And as John White alluded to, especially initially in Louisiana, they'd never seen this test before. It's not necessarily aligned to their curriculum. And so it may very well be that the initial negative results were partly a fact that they were being evaluated by a different test that was not aligned with their curriculum. Presumably they've had a couple of years, they're at least familiar with the test. And also in Louisiana, we had this strange development where the state switched from its long-standing ILEAP test that the public schools knew well to a PARC test that was new for both the public and privates in the third year. So you could argue that the third year was the best and fairest test of the achievement effects of the program. We didn't find any results. So I think there are a lot of factors at play, but most fundamentally it's that school choice involves a lot of change. It involves students adjusting to new schools. It involves schools adjusting to new populations of students coming into them. And so it's perfectly reasonable to see negative effects in the immediate term. But what's more important, of course, is what happens in the long term. And so long-term achievement effects should really be our focus. And as Beth pointed out, attainment is really important. And it's there where initially the voucher studies are showing clear positive effects.
I think it's important to go back to when these programs were birthed. And the public discourse, and this is kind of one of my concerns about the ascendancy of this issue in the public consciousness, would have you believe that all voucher programs or all private school choice programs are sort of the same, and either you have one or you don't. In fact, the policy design from one state or District of Columbia could to the next could just, they vary radically. And if you look at where how the Indiana and Louisiana programs and when they came about under two governors, Mitch Daniels and Bobby Jindal, who for all of their kind of markets and libertarian leanings were also real accountability hawks. Those two governors created the letter grade systems replicated off of Florida in their states. And so you had two systems that were created at a time where, around Race to the Top, sort of contradictorily, choice and accountability were both being pursued very zealously. And so these two programs have, compared to their peers nationally, uncommon levels of comparability and accountability. And so, nobody asked when the year one studies came out in Louisiana, for example, well, how did the public school funding program do when there was accountability in the first year? The answer, the schools were terrible. And nobody would have thought otherwise, because in the first 2 years of an accountability system, the schools had real challenges with implementation. When you put schools that have never been accustomed to that kind of a shift in the academic infrastructure around them in 4 different subject areas, you're going to have challenges. The good news is that the Indiana program and Louisiana program are both designed for the long term because government is in a position to act on those data, and parents are in a position to act on those data, and that's important.
So just one other observation on the pattern of results. So I think Pat was right on when he said that they tend to work more and work better in urban areas. There's another way of framing that is that we still don't have any statewide cases that have positive results. And I think, they may get better, and certainly the trajectory is positive in Indiana and Louisiana, but the policy is ahead of that, right? So now there's been a very strong push towards statewide programs, and now talk of federal support for expanding that further. So I think in that respect, the policy is out ahead of this. Again, why does it work in urban areas better? Well, so it could be because the schools there are just not as good, right? So we lose sight of the comparison group in all of this. That we're comparing private schools or charter schools, or comparing them to something. One reason the DC results may have turned out not as positive in this case is that the charter school sector had ramped up in the interim. So now there's a different comparison group, and it may be harder for the private schools to compete against the new charter schools. So all these things become interdependent. We have to be thinking about what the alternative policies are. So it's not just vouchers kind of by themselves. We're comparing vouchers in private schools to traditional public schools, and now in some cases to charter schools. So there are different alternatives, and I think John's right about there being such different policies. I think there's some charter policies that are actually a lot like voucher policies in having weak accountability and weak oversight and so on. There are also some voucher programs like Louisiana that actually look more like charter policies. Yeah. So that the labels are becoming less clear, and that we need to focus more on fundamentally what do we want the government to do, right? So there's accountability, there's admissions, there's civil rights issues. So there are these kinds of questions that are sort of separate from these labels that we're attaching at this point.
The only thing I would disagree with in all that is the question of whether the policy, in this case at least, is out ahead of the research. Because the difference between private sector and the charter sector is that the private sector already exists. In other words, on the charter sector, you approve charter schools because they don't yet exist. You authorize them to exist. But the Catholic system has existed for decades, centuries in New Orleans. So the schools are there. The question is, how do you make them eligible? And there's one school of thought that would say, well, they should have to prove something before they even become eligible. When you really look at that, I think what you realize is in order for them to prove that they should be eligible, they have to be incented and capitalized to participate. And we have kept a very strong screen, but it's a back-end screen. It's not like the charter process where the screen is very tight up front. It's a back-end screen with the theory that the risk proposition is relatively low. The number of kids is much smaller, and you can immediately say after 1 year of results, no more kids. But so I hesitate to say the policy is out in front of the research because in effect, our feeling has been, given that the sector already exists and is in action at great scale, you have to capitalize them. You have to have the families make the choice in order to really regulate in the first place.
I'm not sure. So what I mean is I'm not sure every state should go out and follow this. So I think it's, having a few states, this is how federalism works, right? We have a few states try something, we have a few cities try something, and then we watch it. We see whether it works. So this is how Obamacare came about, right? It came from Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. That was where it started from, and it seemed to work well. And so some of those ideas were borrowed. I think the same logic applies here. So we have Louisiana trying it, we have Indiana trying it. Okay, let's watch and see how this works. And if it seems to generate improvement, then that would be the point at which you say, okay, well maybe other states should be looking at it. But I think we're moving faster than that. That's when I say we're out ahead of it.
Just to give sort of a practitioner perspective on that, I think the amount of accountability that I understand to exist in both Indiana and Louisiana is enough to give me pause as a private school leader. I think it's one of those things that makes me glad I didn't have to decide whether my school is going to participate or not. And this is where that federalism really comes into play. I mean, as some folks know, Indiana, because of its sports conference, had a culture of accountability across private high schools that predated vouchers. It's one of the kookiest applications of sports in private high schools I've ever seen. They were all accountable to how their kids performed. I get this is my understanding.
And like the NCAA, where the students had to be doing well enough academically.
But DC doesn't have that, and so it's interesting for me to look at the relatively low school participation rate in Louisiana, and to speculate about the degree of accountability as a set of brakes on the participation. But that's where I think there are so many different factors that come into play. And so it's all to your point that it's going to be different in different states. And to what extent are we okay with that?
Beth, how do you think about these findings of kind of a loss, negative effect earlier on and some recovery after that? I mean, does that surprise you, or is that consistent with what you see in terms of new kids coming into your school who maybe don't have a long history in the private sector? Like, how do you...
That's a good question.
Kind of reaction to that?
I'm surrounded by people who are really good with data, and I'm about to speculate, and so that makes me feel kind of nervous.
Generate hypotheses.
There you go. Thank you. All right, here we go. Free range. I do think it's important to note that it wasn't just a couple of students coming into a new school. It was, I would imagine, blocks of kids coming in and changing the culture of schools as they came. And so I do think that the findings don't surprise me for a couple of different reasons. My hunch is that the kids acclimating to the culture in the first year took a lot of everybody's oxygen. I mean, I hate to say it, it's about uniforms. Like, the amount of attention we have to spend to a kid coming in to our school who's never had to tuck their shirt in before. And it takes a little bit of oxygen from the educational enterprise. And so if you multiply that times all of these kids and sort of all of these expectations, I do think charter schools are much more intentional about creating social norms. Catholic schools have existed long enough that those norms sort of get inhaled and passed down from one person to another with less intentionality. And my hunch is that those norms had to be more intentionally created so that the educational enterprise should go on. And I also speculate that there was a greater need for differentiation in those classrooms than those teachers had been used to producing. So my hunch is that the teachers just had to get better at differentiation in a real hurry.
Take some of your questions in a minute, so start thinking. But before we do that, Beth, one more thing I wanted to hear from you is kind of this sort of decision process about schools deciding whether to participate, what it means for them. Obviously, the DC program and Louisiana programs are pretty different. You kind of flag this issue. Is it a couple of new kids? Is it lots of new kids? John talked about the accountability that sometimes comes with these. My sense is quite a bit stricter in Louisiana than it is in DC in terms of testing requirements and whatnot. But you're kind of from the school perspective, like how do you think about these kind of design questions?
Well, I want to get into heaven, so that's kind of one of my priorities. So I hate to say it, that it should be a priority for every Catholic school leader, and so we are ideologically driven in all of this. If our ideology says that there should be a preferential option for the poor, then gosh darn it, we should figure out how to make this work. And I'm embarrassed by Catholic schools that don't try to make it work because of ideological reasons. But I do think there's a mix of God and mammon in it all. It doesn't surprise me at all that the Catholic schools who are more likely to participate are the ones that have capacity, and who are sort of eager for enrollment. I speculate that part of that is that most Catholic schools were working class and middle class institutions in a country that's losing its working class and middle class. So the people we used to serve can now no longer afford our schools. And our funding model, which was based on a free labor force of priests and nuns, has now shifted. So I do think from an individual sort of school participant, there's a mix of, does this fit where we are ideologically? Does this help us financially? And is the ideological, educational, and financial benefit to our school worth the accountability hit that we're going to take in needing to change our school culture? In some cases, it doesn't change the school culture. So I don't want to paint all Catholic schools as being sort of, anti-accountability, but let's face it, what most people buy when they buy private school now is they are buying out of the culture of accountability into one that's more outcomes, that's the accountability comes from where your sense as a parent is of the school rather than the school test scores. So I think it's a constellation of different factors that lead every school leader to sort of make that decision. I don't know if that helps. So.
Great, so I want to turn to some audience questions. You can also email us your questions. I believe the address is events@urban.org. So I figure we'll do a few questions and then we'll come back and cause there's some more things that I want to talk about. We always put the questions at the end, so I thought it'd be fun to mix it up a little bit. Front row, right here.
Ann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. Our policy analysts have identified religious schools that receive public funding, and they suspend and expel LGBTQ kids because it violates their religious beliefs. So how do you handle that within this kind of a system?
I want to ask a clarifying question. Have you found that is true among schools that accept voucher students? Or is it just true of private schools in general? Because I think it's an important distinction.
That I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's this kind of broader question of civil rights that's come up, right, in the school choice discussion. Where do we, where do the rights of individual schools to decide who to admit end, and where do what protections do we put in place for the schools, especially those that receive public money, can't discriminate, whether it's based on religion or sexual orientation. So how do you all think about this as a Catholic school, as a state administrator?
I've heard of these things happening. We've not had anything like it. We assign every student to a school. We expect the schools to serve every child. Part of the accountability system is about attrition generally, although and retention. And so retention is valued. Attrition is a problem in our system. If I were to hear of a case like that, which I haven't, I would intervene. That's not acceptable. And it's not acceptable in a publicly funded program. The law regarding whether it's acceptable in an environment where there is not any public funding, I think that's a question for somebody who's more of an expert in that domain. But just removing kids because of who the kids are, this is a publicly funded program. The taxpayer paid for this program. We all paid for this program. And it doesn't work for the values of a system that is in that respect a public system, then that institution should not be participating.
I think there's a broader point here. So I think there's a civil rights angle to what you're saying, but I think there's also just a broader question of access. And so we talked about admissions as being one of the key policy areas that affects this. That we want people to have real access, real choices, and not just the existence. The existence of a voucher doesn't provide access necessarily, although it could be a step in that direction. So there are policies around discipline and around expulsion and all the things after. It's not just the admissions process, but there's a whole set of things that affect students' real access to schools that I think are important here. And I think that's really fundamentally, that's what the debate is about. It's to what degree are we going to impose those kinds of rules, and to Pat's research about the effects that might have on schools' willingness to participate, because they are used to having, private schools have admission requirements, and they're stricter and disciplined. They're much more likely, well, I won't say that. They have rules, and I've had some of my kids at some points in private schools where they'll kick students out pretty quickly. So I think that whole constellation of policies is important in this.
And this is where I look at it as a practitioner and not necessarily from a policy standpoint, although I know that's very tricky in this context. Of course we have LGBTQ kids at my school. We have human beings at our school. If you get more than 10 of them in a room, statistically speaking. As a Catholic school, our policy is that no one should be having sex with anyone. Right? Unless they're married. Which none of our students are married. So, I think from this equality standpoint, we have students who have same-sex parents. That's the reality of a lot of Catholic schools. If Catholic schools across the nation quit admitting kids whose parents weren't in church-recognized marriages, Catholic schools would decline in enrollment pretty precipitously. But I do think, at the risk of, I don't want to be too glib about it, the reality is that those students are served by our schools. And hopefully our stance on disciplinary action is equal across the board. I do think it is a really tricky question of how do we venture into this territory where we want to preserve everybody's freedoms, including the freedom of religious liberty. And I'll leave that question open rather than answer it.
Yeah. And I'll just add, obviously there's almost no research on this question. There might be sort of anecdotal cases that cause concern. But the one study I'm aware of, I think it was about a month ago, it was supported by an LGBTQ advocacy organization, and it was a climate survey, school climate survey, in public, private religious, and private non-religious schools. And they actually found that reports of bullying of LGBTQ students were lowest in private religious schools. Now, there isn't a rigorous design, there could be selection issues and everything, but it's also possible that the culture that religious schools develop, I think there's concern that a religious culture in a school is going to be exclusive, but there are also many cases where a religious culture of a school can be very overtly inclusive. And so I think we shouldn't be quick to judge the status of private religious schools as necessarily exclusive or inclusive.
Nor should we be quick to judge the status of public schools as particularly inclusive or particularly exclusive. And I do think that's just an important piece of context to raise in this, is that every sin, pardon the religious metaphor there, every sin that private schools are guilty of, some public school somewhere has been guilty of too.
Hi, Sasha Podolsky with the National Coalition for Public Education. This is a question for Superintendent White. You mentioned that there's an application process that's essentially blind to status of disability as well as socioeconomic background in Louisiana. And I think that's really interesting because that means that students with IEPs are accepted at the normal rate that they would be in private school education. We know in places like Georgia, for example, they actually require parents participating in their voucher program to sign away their IDEA rights before participating. In DC, they don't have to follow IDEA, neither do they have to follow it in Indiana. So what's in the water, I guess, in Louisiana that makes the private, especially private religious schools, able to comply with IDEA when it seems like this enormous barrier in other states?
Well, public schools are not, or excuse me, private schools in Louisiana as elsewhere are not overseen by IDEA. They are not able to turn down. They never see whether a child has a disability. They're not able to reject a child when they come to them with a disability. The research, and Pat should certainly speak to this, does imply that there are at least some cycle of consideration of the IEP at the school level. And there are also some schools that do in our program designate themselves as specifically demonstrated capacity to serve students with disability. We also have a particular voucher program exclusively for students with disabilities. So I think there's a lot of shades in all of this. There are two things, though, that I would emphasize. First, a local education agency in the public system is not itself required to provide the services for every child with every disability in every individual school. And I think that's a nuance that often gets lost in this. The administration of IDEA in a place like New York City does not mean that 1,500 schools in New York City all have the ability and receive students who have an assigned IEP with a certain designated disability in every single disability category. So the way that we address the complexities of assigning a general population with a wide variety of learning needs to a set of individual schools is to say we're going to err on the side of assigning every kid, and you're going to take every kid, but we're also going to inform the parent up front of what the demonstrated history of this school is by their own admission as to whether or not they serve disability, they provide this service and that service. We want the parent to make an informed choice. We want the school to not have any discretion as to whether or not to serve the child, but we really, really, really want to make, especially in an environment that's not overseen or regulated by IDEA, we want the parent to make an informed choice as to whether or not this particular school, knowing that it's not part of a larger LEA, provides adequate services. And in the years covered by the study, 13% of parents that applied or applied on behalf of 13% of the children had an IEP, which is a larger population than the rest of our population. We're a little bit above 11% statewide. And also we run the program specifically for students who are covered under IDEA and who have an IEP for that program as well. Oh, you're talking about the kids who are in the specific voucher program for that. And what are you asking?
How do the private religious schools there make it work?
You know, I mean, look, and this is anecdotal, I guess, to answer the question, but they find themselves able to customize their academic program and to see it of great benefit for reasons that are both humanitarian and I think, frankly, in some cases, financial, enrollment, and marketing-wise. And that's certainly the case in Washington. It's certainly the case elsewhere. I do think that we're entering a bit of a different environment now with the Supreme Court rulings being what they have been recently, and I think we do not, fair to say, have a very litigious environment, as certainly is the case in this city, regarding students with disabilities seeking admission to institutions that are private, but we'll see how all that changes.
And I've examined students with disabilities participating in means-tested voucher programs in Louisiana and also in Milwaukee. And what's interesting, just following on John's comment, is that the way students with disabilities are treated in private schools participating in voucher programs, it's not terribly different from how they're treated in the public system. All the guaranteed rights of IDEA do not transfer to the private schools. Now, the students don't lose those rights. Those rights are always there for them if they want to return to the public system, but they do not transfer into the private system. But basically what you see is, as John pointed out, you see some private schools that exclusively serve students with disabilities. If you don't have a disability, you can't go to that private school. You have many schools that serve students with mild to moderate disabilities that supplement the student's education with tutors or with an education specialist, much in the way that public schools try to provide services in the least restrictive environment in the public system. And then you have some private schools that basically just say, we're going to mainstream this student. We think that this student with a disability is going to be successful in our general educational program. You see a little more full inclusion on the private school side than you'll see on the public school side. But other than that, it's generally pretty reflective of how students are served in the public system. There's just less of the process, of the procedural guarantees and the process that's hardwired into IDEA. And also there's much less labeling. I mean, we found this in Milwaukee too, is that a lot of times students will enter with a disability label, and then the private school will either ignore or remove that disability label. And in some cases, parents have told us that's why they wanted to go to the private school. They wanted their child to shed their disability label.
Right there. Yep.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rebecca Toyin Doherty, and I'm from Alvina Foundation. My question goes to your comment regarding parents buying out of accountability by going to private schools. And when you think of any organization, whether it's private or public, we tend to also think about the fact that accountability encapsulates ethics and governance, and to a certain extent, every organization should be held accountable. So is the bigger issue the fact that what we use as an accountability system right now is problematic in terms of the indicators? And should accountability shift to the demand side beyond school choice and vouchers?
Yeah, I appreciate the call to more careful language than what I used, because I do think parents are in some cases buying out of the system of accountability as it's currently practiced in a lot of public and public charter schools, which is primarily achievement testing. Believe me, they are looking for accountability. You know, on the high school level, they're looking for that list of where our kids go to college. So it's attainment versus achievement accountability. But you're right, it's not, they're not abdicating a sense of accountability altogether. So I appreciate your pushing for that clarification.
Can I just maybe throw in a note on this? I went to a private school, grades kindergarten through 12. There was plenty of accountability. It's called the college list at the end of the year. You know, I mean, by the time you graduate, that better be a pretty great college list, or else there's going to be problems. The problem is that when you translate that across 14,000 school boards, there's not that same pressure on the entity to perform. And I'm very nervous about the rhetoric that I hear on both sides of the aisle about grassroots accountability. Accountability just to the family. Well, that's enough to that'll get you there. And that's not to mention all the anti-testing stuff. Sitting here on this dais, we should not for a second think that parents all love standardized testing or anything like that, nor should we think that they think it's the leading indicator about the vitality and prosperity of their children. But it tells us something extremely important. And we have a better education system for it in the public system, and I believe largely in the private system at this scale, given the fact that not every school has built-in institutional pressure regarding a prestigious list of four-year universities at which that its kids attend.
Well, and I think to support your point, I think I'm correct in saying that private school enrollment isn't increasing nationally. So I do think there are parents who are embracing the choices that they have in public and charter schools, and perhaps part of what's driving those choices is a sense of, aha, we have a clearer sense of where these schools, how these schools are performing.
Blue?
Hi, I'm Phyllis Jordan with Future Ed at Georgetown. It seemed to me that the successes, that the rebound you saw was for kids who persisted at the school. Yet I know in DC I've heard there's a lot of churn in terms of kids not sticking with it. I was wondering, in your case, Beth, are you finding that kids who are voucher kids are less likely to persist in your school than other kids? And generally, did you find anything like that in Louisiana about the churn?
That's a good question, and I don't have good data to support it. I do think there is a culture of churn in DC that I think predated vouchers. So I think I don't know that churn is greater among our voucher kids than it is among our kids as a whole. I honestly don't know. I do think Patrick can speak maybe to some of the research about the achievement and attainment of kids who, I think this is where true choice comes into play. You know, part of what's been fun about talking to some of the families is that we have some families who try our school for a year or two, and then they think, no, actually, the better choice for our kid is the public school. And, you know, while I never admit a kid not wanting to see them become 18 and all kind of cool and on the verge of grown up, I applaud that as true choice. it's not true choice if the public schools aren't a viable option as well.
Yeah, we see a very interesting pattern in terms of student switching or student churn in the LSP. And basically, it's true that we estimate the effect of the program on students who remain in the program for the 3 years. We adjust statistically to remove any bias, any selection bias, by the fact that these are somewhat different than the ones who don't persist. But we also are able to disaggregate and look at the performance record of students who switched back to public school after that traumatic first year, and students who stayed and persisted to the end. And the pattern of recovery and rebound is very similar for both of those groups. So the groups that switched back to the public schools tended to have experienced a greater drop in achievement the first year, so perhaps a signal that private schooling isn't for them. And they had a similar recovery once they re-entered the public school, as did the students who experienced the drop, wasn't as severe for them, and then persisted and stuck with it. So it does suggest maybe that parents are keen off of these market signals and these experiences and saying, okay, it looks like private schooling isn't a good fit for my child. Let's go back to a public schooling environment that is a better fit. Now, it doesn't prove it. This is non-causal. But the pattern is consistent with that idea.
Can I just make I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just a brief editorial comment on this. I have found that when you have high levels of mobility, especially in urban settings with high poverty environments, in the traditional public system, people bemoan the poverty and talk about how hard it is to educate kids given all the mobility. But then when it's charter schools and non-public schools, people talk about how the schools must be kicking everybody out and sending them back to the traditional public schools. And my experience has been that this is largely about the lives of tens of thousands of people whose place in the workplace and in society is particularly chaotic. And the question in front of us really is, how paternalistic or not do we want to be in trying to regulate that movement? And if there's an indictment in all of this, I don't think it's on the schools, I think it's on the system, which tends to sit back and watch as both private and public systems churn kids who are poor around as if it's normal. It's not normal. I mean, people who have means don't move their kids every year and certainly don't move them during the year unless they absolutely have to. And they find ways to make sure it never happens. In New Orleans, we largely run the system through the same process of admissions. And we have just said there are no transfers just by showing up and saying, I want to transfer anymore. It's not normal. We're not going to do it. And that over the course of a 6-month period during the middle of the year, other than for geographic and hardship reasons, there are not transfers. And that comes at a cost because it's against the principle on some level of choice. But ultimately, coupled with other things around suspensions and expulsions, across a system that looks at public and non-public options relatively comparably, I think has had a very positive and stabilizing effect, albeit with some cost.
I think that you're raising an important point on churn, and it's important for a few different reasons. So one is, and John was just sort of, I think, indirectly alluding to the fact that it's very disruptive. So everybody's choice affects everybody else, which is one of the things that makes schooling distinctive. So if there's a lot of churn, if students are moving around, it's not just disruptive for that student and not good for that student, but it's also then disruptive for in the receiving school where they end up, because then the teacher's having to get them on track and so on. So I think other things being equal, we definitely want a system with less churn, maybe just enough to let the market work, so to speak, and let people exit when things aren't working well, but not a lot of it. The other reason it's important is possibly going to the prior question about how we measure performance, right? So the focus on test scores and so on. I think with ESSA, we're now looking at a wider range of measures and states are looking at that. One possibility in a choice-based setting would be to look at mobility maybe adjusted for income or adjusted somehow in the same way we want to adjust test scores based on value-added type approaches where we're trying to account for what we might expect to happen given the geography and the student population. So it's both something we want to avoid to some extent, but also possibly an interesting signal that we might be able to use to evaluate these systems.
I want to hit on two questions in our final 5 minutes. The first one is sort of directed at John, but anyone's welcome to weigh in, which is what are the big open questions here? I mean, especially Louisiana, we now have a pretty tall stack of studies, thanks to Patrick and his team and to ERA. But what else is it that, sort of as a policymaker, you feel like we need to know to make better decisions about these programs?
Well, I think actually Pat mentioned it, and by the way, he's done some with Doug, some I think really important work around the characteristics of effective schools that to me asks actually in a way more profound questions than which sector is better or not. And I think there's are we going to get beyond the question of, oh, is it a private school, then it's good, or is it a private school, then it's doing something bad? And to the question of what is it about a good private school or a good traditional public school or a good charter school that more schools can adopt? And is there ever going to be a means of doing that? We were just talking about a mutual friend who works for the Partnership for Inner City Education in New York, which I think is one of the most interesting elements or programs in our country, because what they're trying to do is to enact some of the management and pedagogical principles of charter schools without compromising the principles of Catholic education in the Archdiocese of New York. And I think that's a real question. Is there going to be a response to accountability in the Louisiana system, I'm assuming in the Indiana system, or are we just going to take these things as kind of measurement and everybody goes about their business? Some win, some lose. It's kind of a market deal. The best element of accountability at its best is when it actually drives improvement in practice. And that is an open question. Is there going to be investment philanthropically, investment from the government, and most importantly, investment from administrators and teachers in better practice on the ground in response to accountability?
So the last thing I want to talk about in our remaining few minutes is the federal role in all this. So we kind of have to talk about this. Right? We're here in Washington. We have a still relatively new administration that wants to do something on school choice. Most of the experimentation we have outside of DC has been driven by states. And now we're starting to see some of the fruits of those efforts and see some studies. But we're going to see, we haven't gotten much in the way of specifics from the administration on what they want to do on school choice, but I expect we'll see something before too long. So I'm curious to hear everyone's perspective to kind of close things out on how do we take the evidence we have about what states are doing and translate it into some advice for what the administration here in Washington should be pushing for, what Congress should be thinking about.
Well, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, which I think we're ahead of ourselves. So I think a good role for the federal government here would be some pilot programs with rigorous research funded by IES, including going back and looking at some of the programs that already exist. So not even just creating new pilot programs, but let's understand how these things are working. Let's see whether we can find places where it seems to be working at the scale at which even states are now talking about it. So I still think we're still missing that case of a state that's doing this where students seem to be performing better on any measures. I don't want to limit it to just test scores, but I think we still need that. We still need that case and to figure out what it is that makes that case work, and then move ahead. So I think at this stage that would be the most productive thing to do.
I think the DC program has a few cautionary tales embedded in it about federally run education programs. I think in the honor of the principle of subsidiarity and making the politics easier, the more local voucher programs can be, the better. I suspect that one of the brakes on increasing capacity for private school slots in DC is the fact that we know that the whole program is beholden to federal politics and the way that those winds shift. So we don't know from 5 years to 5 years whether the program is going to continue. So if you're a smart private school, if you're running a smart elementary school, like your kids are not going to get all the way through before the political winds can shift. So I do think that's a cautionary tale that maybe the DC program offers to this notion of a federal program.
That's a great point. True at the state level too, by the way. Politics and budgetary swings make people hesitant to get in the game. Yeah. Two things I would say. I think the federal government is first at its best when it's investing in proven winners and scale. And I agree with Doug's point about, there's the policies at scale are sort of unclear. But there are individual groups of schools, public, traditional, charter public, and non-public, that are clearly doing great things. And the federal government at its best is finding ways to invest in scaling proven actors. You look at Hope Christian Academy or Cristo Rey or other groups of schools, the Partnership for Inner-City Education, huge effects this year, or gains on the New York State assessment. They should be investing in growing these kinds of entities. But secondly, the federal government is at its best when it's not creating incoherence at the state level. And a program that exclusively works around, while I understand the philosophical and political advantages of that, if you create incoherence from a regulatory perspective, you devalue the entire enterprise, you inhibit the entire enterprise, and Head Start would be a good example of a program that by working around state education agencies has created massive levels of incoherence in early childhood systems.
Last word.
Yeah, so I think that any federal initiatives in private school choice are going to be, first of all, targeted toward areas where the federal government has special jurisdiction, as Beth mentioned, and we discussed, the District of Columbia. But also Senator McCain has introduced a bill for private school choice programs in Native American schools on reservations. Those obviously many of those would be in his home state of Arizona. And that's an area where we know that they've had a terrible record of performance as schools for disadvantaged students. A second area would be schools for active military, so basically school choice initiatives for active members of the armed forces. That's another possibility. In terms of any national private school choice program, I think the chance of a voucher initiative is pretty much zero. And I think because of many of those legitimate concerns, I've heard some discussion of a tax credit scholarship program, which leaves the federal government a bit at arm's length in terms of encouraging, incentivizing resources on the tax side for charitable donations to scholarship granting organizations. I suspect that that's the initiative that's going to be proposed by the administration. But I have no idea what the details of that would be and what the real scale would be of that. But I think the idea that there would be some federally controlled private school voucher program national in scope is zero.
Just make one observation on that. I think you're probably right about the direction that they're going. But just want to point out, if they do go that route, we'll probably never know whether it worked or not, right, in most of the states. So unless they're not going to require measurement, or they're not going to, unless the states decide to, on their own, to create the measures that you would need. There's kind of an irony here that the only way to figure out whether these things work is to put the measures on them, but the measures are regulations that the schools don't want. So there's this tension there. But I think if they went that route, that we probably never know.
Yeah, there's one tax credit scholarship program that has been evaluated rigorously. It's in Florida. It's the second largest one, I think, to Pennsylvania. Maybe it's the largest now. The Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program, and Figlio's evaluation found evidence of positive effects on reading, but that was complicated by the fact they allowed the schools to administer their own tests, so there was an equating of tests that was part of it, and it's more difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible to evaluate a tax credit scholarship program.
I'm not saying it is impossible. I'm saying the direction it's going would probably make it impossible unless the states decide, as in Florida, right? So if other states did something like that, although I think David would even say that his results were indeterminate because they were comparing the public school tests to a whole bunch of other private school tests. So even in Florida, I think it's not clear we know what's going on. And that's a case where they did have some requirement. I think a lot of the other programs set up that way wouldn't have any testing requirement.
So we're out of time, but thank all of you for coming today. Thanks to those of you watching on the live stream, and please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.
It was great to meet you. And you.